morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us at the Free Market Foundation for this Valentine's edition of the Media and Members Briefing. And unfortunately, we're not going to celebrate love this morning. We're going to talk about something far more serious, and that's inequality and Oxfam's recent report. There's a lot in it, and I'm not going to preempt the speaker's thunder by highlighting the main points. But I would like to introduce Louw, the Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation, the founder, or one of the founding members of the Free Market Foundation. And he has got a comprehensive presentation where he'll take you through why Oxfam should really be renamed Oxscam. So if you're welcome, Leon.
There's good news and bad news. There is some love in the air, and that is love for the poor, which I hope will become apparent. And also I gather there is someone from Oxfam here, and by referencing the organization, I obviously don't necessarily mean any individual. So if the individual doesn't identify with the things I'm going to point out, then that's good. If the person does, or the people, I don't know how many, then we have an issue, because I will try to persuade you that what Oxscam, and I will call it Oxscam, does annually at its jamboree in Davos is to generate a spew of babble and propaganda with a view to achieving all sorts of nefarious objectives which I will identify. So I will go through all of the issues, and I will go through to what extent Oxscam, and I'm going to call it that, and I keep taunting them. I want them to charge me. I want to go to court and have this out in a court of law. So whoever it is here representing Oxscam, please consider me to be defaming the organization willfully. And this is why, and I repeat that there are good people in it. There are many people who work for it, and I presume most are perfectly decent people, and most are there because they do care about charity and welfare. That seems to be very different from those who are at the helm and those who are the planners, as we shall see. Firstly, instead of a disclaimer, I'm having a claimer. I'm going to make it very clear where I stand and what I'm going to be arguing and saying. And I'm going to start off, which is not normally how you would do a presentation of this kind, which is lots of empirical data, with a personal view. And my personal view is that it is a scam. The organization has become a scam. It used to be a legitimate charity and has drifted far away from its original purpose. And as I will try to show, the reason it's done that is because the purpose it originally had was to care for destitute people around the planet. The number of destitute people, as it says on its own website, has declined precipitously towards the vanishing point. It's therefore reinventing itself as an organization that, instead of caring for the destitute, has started saying the real issue is inequality. So if everyone is a millionaire, then of course compared to billionaires there's inequality, and it will then have a legitimate function because it wants to bring about equality between billionaires and millionaires. So if you go onto the equality bandwagon, then you basically can always argue that you should win, because there will always be an inequality of some sort between people. And I will go into the meaning or meaninglessness of the word equality or inequality. It's actually close to a weasel word. It's almost meaningless and probably has only one credible and legitimate meaning, which is equality at law. It has many other meanings, and I will go through them and point out what the problem is with them. So I called it Oxfam flim-flam, and let me define flim-flam. It is the dictionary definition of flim-flam is a trick or deception, swindle or confidence game, skillful persuasion or clever manipulation of the victim. And there certainly are victims here, ranging from the elites who believe it to the poor who are victims in material terms without knowing why. It is also, flim-flam is deceptive nonsense or twaddle or fraud. That's the dictionary definition of the word flim-flam. Then Oxfam's track record, I'm going to just look at that a bit, and I'm going to go through some of the very dodgy data which it spews in a sort of, or regurgitates actually. It's sort of like regurgitates, I don't know, it sort of vomits up the stuff every year. But every year it's a little bit different, or actually quite a lot different, which is one of the reasons why it should be doubted. And then some of its dodgy staff. I've said the majority of staff, it's a big organization with lots of staff, are arguably decent, nice people, and I'm inclined to say some of them are my best friends, but they aren't. I actually don't know anyone who works for Oxfam. I would like to meet them, and I would like to become their friend if they believe in its original purpose and they want it to return to its original purpose. I care about the poor, not the rich. So this is part of my claimer, and I want to make that clear. I actually don't care a darn about what the rich do or how rich they are or what percentage of the wealth they have. It is to me a completely irrelevant statistic and number and discussion. It has got nothing to do with whether you care for the living standards or the quality of the poor. That is a completely separate issue. And if the poor are better off when the rich are better off, then you should be in favor of the rich being better off. And the poor seem to be in favor of it themselves because they migrate always in only one direction, and that is from places where there are fewer rich people to where there are more rich people. So obviously, in the opinion of the poor, living in the countries with the billionaires is better than living in the countries without them. And the countries where there are more and more of them, such as India, those are the countries to which the poor go from countries where there are few, like Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nepal, its neighbors. So I'm not denying that there's inequality or poverty, and I want to get that firmly in everyone's head. The trouble with this sort of thing is if, for example, somebody proposes a bad law that violates the rule of law to protect women and children or animals or whatever, if you raise concerns about it as bad jurisprudence, you then presume to be against women and children or animals. So that's why I have to say no, pointing out that the rich don't affect the poor at all, or not negatively, whatever the rich mean, we'll get to that. It doesn't mean that I'm denying that there is real poverty and that it is a real problem. And those of you who know me know that I spend a lot of my time, especially over weekends, working in the poorest of the poor communities, with open sewers and shanties and boxes. And if anyone doubts that, I invite them to visit one of the communities that I'm very involved with at any time. I'll happily take you there. Also, I'm excited about humanity's greatest accomplishment. And let me just point that out. We are sitting here at a time when there's never been greater equality in history. There has never been an elimination of poverty and a rise of living standards of the kind that is occurring and occurred in the last 3 or so decades. It is a spectacular time to be alive. For the first time ever, there is no mass starvation. The people here with grey hair will remember that in the early days of newsreels and TV, the typical newscast used to have starving people. Masses of them in Ethiopia and Chad and Bangladesh and elsewhere. Starvation was common. And in countries that were not yet open, like China and parts of India, it was common. The younger people in this audience have actually never seen a starving person on the media because starvation has virtually been eliminated. That doesn't mean the poor aren't poor, and it doesn't mean we don't want to see their conditions improve, but this is astounding. And you'd think that somebody would want to celebrate this triumph over destitution, over extreme poverty. And instead of celebrating the triumph over extreme poverty or even claiming credit for it, which I would do if I were in Oxfam, I would say we achieved it, even though it's not necessarily true. It's now decided that the real problem isn't extreme poverty but extreme wealth. That extreme wealth is somehow a problem and must be destroyed and must be undermined and taxed. This is its current message. This is what it said this year at Davos. Get rid of the rich, destroy them. There is no mention of what this will do to the poor. Is this good for the poor somehow? Will this help the poor somehow? It's lost sight of its purpose, which is to care about the poor. And it now cares about the rich, and it cares about them in this very loathsome, negative, hateful way, without suggesting the rich did anything wrong to become rich. There's no hint that there was somehow that they cheated or fraud or harmed. They might well have actually just served the poor, employed the poor, provided the food that means the poor are no longer starving. But no, they must be pulled down. And we'll see why Oxfam wants this to happen. I care about the poor, not the rich. I would argue that decent people care about the poor, not the rich. Decent people don't care about the rich. They're not obsessed with the rich the way Oxfam and people like Piketty and a sort of growing number of local vocals are. And then Oxfam is obsessed with the rich, as I say, except themselves. And I'm going to give you some idea of what they pay themselves. They're very rich people. And the executives of Oxfam are amongst the wealthiest people on earth, and they all earn much more than hundreds or thousands of people in the poorer countries earn. And this doesn't seem to bother their conscience in the slightest. So, we do have what I call inequality hysteria. The world is in the grip of an inequality feeding frenzy fueled by extreme claims. So what happens is if you Piketty or Oxfam or whatever, you say, oh, 1% earn more than half the world or all the world or the rest of the world. Or, you come up with some number. It doesn't really matter if the number's valid. It doesn't matter if it's researched. It doesn't matter if it's based on any econometric model. You just say it. You just declare it. You just say, did you know? It's a sort of like a dinner table thing. Did you know that 5 people own half of all the world's wealth? You say that at a dinner table, and the chances are you'll be invited back to that same dinner table. If you say, on the other hand, at the dinner table, did you know that the wealth are better off than ever before, the chances are you won't be invited back, because it's not exciting, it's not sexy, it's not dramatic, doesn't have this appeal, this ring of just bleating out some number that sounds amazing and extreme and dramatic and scores points with anybody who happens to be around to listen. News-hungry media, I'm afraid to say, soak up the inequality propaganda uncritically, there are exceptions, obviously. But by and large, probably 9 out of 10 media people love it because it's newsworthy. It's a nice newspaper headline. It's a nice headline of a magazine article. It's a nice TV program to have. Did you know that the rich are getting richer faster than the poor and exploiting the poor, and the poor are worse off, and poverty is increasing and inequality is increasing? That's good media. So the media loves it when Oxfam comes with the scam. And that's, I suppose, what the media is there to do, or most people in the media. Power and wealth hungry politicians love it, because they say you need a bigger government, you need higher taxes, you need to build more houses, you need to build bureaucratic and government empires. So, of course, this is just, if you're a politician, this is mother's milk for you. This is, apple pie. And this is why it grows. And then inequality propagandists advance vested interests, their own interests, lavish jobs and lifestyles, status and power, and flim-flam. But having said that, why do ordinary people like it? And I think this is the reason. I know from experience when I say things are better than ever before, people say to me, oh, so you don't care about the poor then? You're saying there's no problem. And I've had this with, for example, the host who often has me on ANN7. She says to me, are you saying therefore there's no problem? And no, no, on the contrary. I'm saying there is a problem, but the reason people like it is because it sounds as if you care, you see. If you say the poor are better off than ever before, it sounds as if you don't care. You're saying don't do anything or there isn't a problem. If on the other hand you say the poor are worse off than ever before, you sound like a nice, decent person. And that's not my theory. This is Stephen, what's his name again? The famous philosopher. Anyway, he, and I'm going to have his name later on, and it'll come back to me. Oh, not Stephen Hawking, Steven Pinker. He's made the point that the problem with pointing out hard facts and figures about how wonderful things are in the modern world for almost everybody, how much better off everyone is than ever before. He says the problem is you sound as if you don't care. If, on the other hand, you say things are worse than ever before, you sound like a decent, caring, sensitive human being. That's a problem. I don't know what the solution is. I don't know how to combat this nonsense and sound caring, other than getting tears in my eyes or something. I'm not good at that either. But it's a real dilemma that one faces. And then Oxfam's deputy chief, let me just go into the ethics of Oxfam. And I'm going to start with this, because I want you to know the nature of the beast, the organization we're dealing with. And whoever is here from Oxfam, you need to know who your colleagues are and your seniors. And hopefully you're not one of these people. I'm hoping you're not caught up in this mire. The deputy chief quit over prostitution scandals in at least 2 and maybe various other countries. Officials brushed off allegations of child abuse, and you'll see in a moment for how long. Crime authorities have been warning for nearly a decade about predatory profiles in Oxfam who gain access to children through the charity work they do. Quite what that means, I don't know, but I didn't look at the reports or files or anything. And Oxfam admits, in quotes, that it failed to adequately act on behavior of staff. This is if this were to happen in the Free Market Foundation, it would be a real problem for me. The head of the counter-fraud unit has been jailed for £1 million fraud, this Edward Mackenzie Green. And so it goes. According to the Daily Mail, Oxfam, I'm quoting it, spends 25% of its income on wages, running costs, 11.6 million on the top 7 staff. 11.6 million rand on the top 7 staff. I've translated from sterling, and other currencies always to rand. Only is the wording they use, Daily Mail, or not Daily Mail, the Daily Mail, 5 billion from its 6.6 billion was used for charitable expenditure. The rest is propaganda and staff and expenses and overheads. Now, that is spent on charitable expenditure is spent on staff who do it. So you must understand we're talking about money that you could plausibly say is spent on its purpose. The rest is consumed, nearly 2 billion rand on existing. Oxfam awards executives with, this is quoting again, Daily Mail, with banker-sized salaries and benefits, including school fees for executives' children, and apparently other stuff, unspecified. Oxfam is under intense pressure over questionable fundraising practices. Again, I don't know what those are. I could have found out, I suppose, if I was interested in doing the research, but this is typically in many media reports. In other words, it's not just one I've selected. The media generally have this view of the organization. Now, it might be unfair, it might be untrue. All of us have been victims of lies and exaggerations about our turpitude, our moral turpitude, our ethics, our values, our principles, me included. So I'm very sensitive to false accusations. I'm just repeating what is out there. As far as I know, for example, there have been no convictions for dodgy fundraising practices by Oxfam. But then where is the scam? We'll get to that. Just something about salaries. The CEO earns 2.1 million a year, plus expenses, gets paid out 2.3 million a year, plus expenses that are paid by Oxfam for flights and hotels and so on. In other words, things that are directly funded by the organization. The deputy's salary is 1.6 million. This is an organization that is objecting to the fact that that they are rich people. Well, but excluding themselves, of course. Staff earn more than the earning of the top 7. Sorry. Staff earnings more than doubled in 7 years, in the last 7 years. Staff with more than 1 million, the number of staff who earn more than 1 million is nearly 100, and the number has tripled in the last year, according to the report I saw. Seems amazing, seems implausible. The wage bill increased 48% to 2 billion last year, 2017. Nearly 50% increase in pay to staff for an organization that's meant to be a charity. The gender advisor, I was looking, they've got all the salaries, what everyone earns. There's somebody called a gender advisor who earns $1 million a year. There's a gifts officer who earns nearly $1 million a year. There's a shop managers, various shops around the world earn 600,000 a year. And there's a South African intern, that's the only South African salary that's publicly available as far as I could find, who gets 100,000 a year for an intern. Now we have some interns here in the Free Market Foundation, and I was reluctant to let them see this number because they might come and agitate or resort to mass action or whatever, and want to match a charity's intern payments. This is a charity, bear in mind, not an organization like ours, which is supposedly a front for white monopoly capital and promoting capitalism. And our interns actually, they earn so little that I wouldn't be surprised if one of them sticks their hands up and says, well, actually, I paid to be an intern here. That may well, we have had that actually. It's characterized, its essence, its nature, is it's characterized by an obsession with wealth, no longer an interest in the poor, and actually a hatred of prosperity. It hates prosperity. It said that there are more millionaires than ever before, the number is rising, and instead of thinking this is great, because the few people who supposedly have all the wealth no longer have all the wealth, all sorts of other people have wealth as well, but no, wealth is this terrible, evil thing. And somehow the countries in which the poor are poor is somehow better because the rich aren't rich. There's a disinterest in and disregard for the poor. Now let me explain that. There's lots of data about the poor. Their life expectancy, their personal possessions, their housing, whether they've got potable water, whether they've got sewage, whether they've got electricity, whether they have access to motorized transport, whether they have medical care. Lots of data, lots of statistics around. I challenge you to find any of those on the Oxfam website. Go there and see whether they have any interest in the poor at all. What happens to them? How do they live? What are their lifestyles? Do they have education? What is happening to their literacy rates? Are literacy rates rising? And you won't get it there. You must go to other websites, for example, Institute of Race Relations, which is represented here, IRR. That's where you'll find the data on such important matters. It portrays the opposite of reality. It portrays a world in which there is poverty because there's wealth. Strange that wealth somehow causes poverty. Whereas in fact there's a world in which there's greater prosperity than ever before. It's sort of, the world is prosperous on steroids at the moment. It's actually quite amazing how this is happening. Readily available facts are denied or ignored. There's a kind of what I call equality and prosperity denialism. It denies that there's greater equality and denies that there's greater prosperity in the extreme sensationalism with simply disregard at all for any hard data. It uses the data, I should say, of Credit Suisse. That's virtually its only source. The source for who's rich is Forbes magazine's rich list. And these two sources are the ones it relies on, but completely misconstruing what is being said in the Credit Suisse analysis and data, which looks, for example, at the amount of debt around the world. It concludes that somebody with debt is poor and somebody without debt is rich. The consequence of that is that it makes it appear as if Americans are poorer than Chinese because Americans have more debt. And it makes it appear that I am more poor than the builder outside because I have more debt. So it makes it appear as if rich people who are creditworthy and therefore have debt are actually poor. And poor people who aren't creditworthy because they have no assets and therefore have no debt, or they have debt that is not formal and documented because it's in the underground or grey economy, like from what we would call a moneylender or machonisa. But without formal debt, you are presumed to be richer than somebody with formal debt. That means all the people with mortgages in Bryanston and Rivonia are poor compared to the people in the shantytown Marathon and Delport who live in boxes and shacks. They, by this logic, are rich. And that is the kind of sort of nonsense. The misconstruction of the Credit Suisse data, which doesn't make that point. Credit Suisse does have some odd things on its website, I might say. For example, its conclusions about what wealth is and who has wealth, which I'll get to in a moment. So the data is designed to deceive. It's a sort of intellectual smoke and mirrors that takes place. There's shifting and contradictory assertions. I'm going to give you some of them in an example. And the real agenda, what it's really all about, is advancing this failed ideology. It wants to get rid of market economy, make the state bigger, make the state stronger, increase welfare, reduce private enterprise and jobs it creates and goods and services it provides. But it's very weird. And let's call it by its name, socialism. So it wants to advance this failed socialism. But the interesting thing is when they succeed. For example, state welfare as a proportion of GDP has gone up over the last 100 years from 1% to roughly 20% in the rich countries. Now this is a huge difference. This means people have pensions and they have medical care and they have education and they have housing and they have infrastructure and policing services and all sorts of things. Huge improvement in the well-being of people thanks to socialism. I'm sorry in the Free Market Foundation to have to point that out. But the strange thing about the paradox of socialists is that when they achieve what they want, they attach no value to it. It's just ignored. It's as if everything they've gained, pensions, welfare, healthcare, it's just excluded. It has no value in this analysis. So it's valued at zero. And so this is very odd, you see. You spend your life lobbying for something, and when you get it, you say it's worthless. Strange thing. Strange thing for a free market capitalist to be saying government welfare is worthwhile, and for a socialist who worked to get it to say it's worthless. That's the paradox. So there's no interest in what minimizes poverty and inequality. In other words, there's nothing I can find on a very substantial website, and I've done a bit of researching through it, that says where is there in the world more equality and what are the circumstances that surround it? What are the policies? And the reason it's not on their website is because market economies, free market economies, have generally lower Gini coefficients and higher equality rates than non-market economies. And poverty, you'd say where in India and China and increasingly in Africa, billions of human beings are rising from poverty. You'd think they would go there and say, what happened? Why all of a sudden, after 50 years of destitution and poverty and starvation, are 1 billion human beings spectacularly better off? You'd think that would interest them. You'd think they'd want to know why, what happened, what were the policy changes that led to this. Not a word on the website, not a word to be found, that I could find. Let me qualify that. Now this is its vested interest. Its vested interest is to maximize poverty, and the reason is obvious. That's what gets it grants, government grants. So it recommends to governments tax the rich more and give us more because there's all this poverty. So there's a nice little neat logic to why you want. And if there isn't real poverty, which it's disappearing fast, then you pretend there is. In other words, you have to keep saying there is. And nobody will countermand you, because then it appears as if they don't care about the poor. So they want to maximize poverty, and they recommend policies that are known to maximize poverty. They're proven maximizers of poverty, what they recommend policy-wise. They want minimum prosperity. They want to destroy success and prosperity. People who succeed, people who grow, they don't accuse them of doing anything immoral. They don't care whether they got rich by employing people and providing goods and services to consumers and innovating technology and going into third world countries and creating jobs. That's of no interest. You just destroy them. They're bad. Being rich, being successful is bad. And they want maximum government, I've mentioned that, and minimum enterprise. Making money by providing goods and services and jobs is presumed a bad thing. So this is the sort of what I call the Ox scams. The 8 richest people were wealthier than the poorest 50 people in this year. This was this year's statistic, so-called. What's the reality? Actually, no, that was, I think, what they said in 2015. It varies a lot, so you've got to know which year you're talking about as to which lie was told. It's kind of quite a challenge. And I had meningitis, so I've got memory loss. So 8 richest combined, 8 richest people are wealthier than the poorest 50% of the planet. The 8 richest people who they list from the Forbes rich list, their wealth is $440 billion. That's what the 8 richest people own together. Now, just to put that in context, that's just slightly less than the cost of one South African power station. Medupi or Kusile is about 300 billion, the two together about 800 billion. So you could build, if they put all their wealth together, the 8 wealthiest people on earth, sorry, that's dollars, I'm talking rand, they would get $440 billion, and that is what they have, and that's a lot. I mean, it's more than what I have, and you can pay a good tip on a cappuccino with that. But it's peanuts. And my colleague economist Jason Urbach said to me, I wonder what the world's peanuts are worth. So I looked it up, and magically, it turns out that they're worth precisely the same amount. In other words, if they put all their wealth together, they could buy 1 year's worth of peanuts. That's how the people are that supposedly own more than the poorest 50%. The world's wealth, according to the source they go to, Credit Suisse, is $300 trillion. They have $440 billion. Now, working with so many zeros, I can't do because my calculator won't handle $300 trillion. It just gives me an error signal. But it's something like this. It's a 1/600th of the world's wealth, according to their own source, Credit Suisse. Now, you tell me whether you buy this line that the bottom half are so poor that they have only 1/600th of the world's wealth. But that's the implication. The 8 richest, if we look at assets, the total capital in the world, assets in the world, the sort of number that's in Piketty's book, you're looking at a 600,000th of the capital. Now, Forbes lists their capital. Oxfam never distinguishes between income and capital and wealth and assets and possessions, or jobs or salaries. But capital, if you compare the 8 richest, the capital they have with the capital of the world's assets, as opposed to GDP, which is income or turnover, you're looking at a 600,000th is what the world's 8 richest people have. That's the scale of misrepresentation and deception and smoke and mirrors. The richest 1%, they say, this year, bagged 82% of 2017 wealth, and the poorest 50% got nothing. So the poorest 50% supposedly last year were no better off, and 82% of the world's growth, which was about 2%, went to the 1%. So that is something like 82% of the 300 trillion. Now, if that happened last year, then the world's 8 wealthiest people are within one single year massively understated by Forbes magazine. Obviously, Forbes got it wrong. They didn't realize these people, Bill Gates and so, became multiples richer last year, because that's what 1% would be of the 300 trillion. What's the reality? The reality is that the assertion is simply a fabrication. It's a misrepresentation of Credit Suisse data. So let's look at some others. They're having said that in 2017, 8 own as much as the poorest 50. This year, they said 42 own the same amount as the poorest 50. So now you'd think that's great. All of a sudden, they're more rich people. That's a good sign, instead of one person ending up with everything, which is what they said would happen 2 years ago, is that it was declining towards that. They showed a graph with firstly a stadium, and then a bus, a ship, and then a bus, and then a plane, and eventually a one single limousine, where one person would have more wealth than the rest of the world's population. That's now disappeared. Now all of a sudden it's going the other way. Instead of a declining thing, it's now a rising thing. The problem was that there were fewer and fewer rich people. This year they said the problem is that there are more and more rich people. Well, which is it? Make up your mind. Which is the thing that is a scandal? Which is the thing that's wrong? And so which is it? Well, there is a footnote. If you look hard enough and you read hard enough, you find them. They say, well, they recalculated last year, and it wasn't 8, but in fact 61. Now that's a sizable miscalculation to be so strident about the data which you cause this annual feeding fest. So 8 to 42 means more people got rich. I would have thought that's good. Or if it's 61 to 42, then it means there's more equality. So kind of like either way, what's their problem? If their adjusted number suggests more equality, not less. So this is the kind of nonsense you get, and I can't be polite about it. It is just nonsense. The number of billionaires rose at an unprecedented rate. One new one every 2 days. One new billionaire every 2 days. Well, then their numbers are again funny, because they supposedly have these numbers. And it's just like bad arithmetic. It's like you'd think they would give it to a standard 2 kid at school, a first grader, and say, just check the numbers, please. Just see that we added up correctly and divided correctly and so on. Because any fool can see the mistakes they make. So the previous alarm was that the number is declining. The new alarm is that it's rising. And it's supposedly equally alarming, whichever way it goes. No matter whether it's rising or falling, it's bad. It's alarming, it's shocking, it's newsworthy, it's disastrous. If we add some more years, 2062 people had as much as the poorest 50%, then 8 or maybe 61, and then 42. It just jumps all over the show. It's just whatever number someone wants to say. My impression is, let's put it this way, they go to Davos and somebody says, well, what number shall we say this year? Sort of over coffee or something, or maybe over copious, expensive French champagne. Maybe that's what these rich people do. Yet the number of billionaires is increasing at an unprecedented rate. But if you take the 61, then the number's less, but the number of billionaires is increasing at an unprecedented rate. Again, the question is, what is it? Does nobody care about actually just getting out a calculator and seeing that these numbers make sense? And the answer is no, nobody cares. The media worldwide splash this twaddle as headlines. Nobody asks any questions. They can say this manifest nonsense, and people love it. It's sponged up as if it's mother's milk. Well, I don't know if you sponge mother's milk, but anyway. The wealth of the poorest 50% fell last year supposedly by 38%. Now again, do I have to tell people in this audience that the numbers don't make sense? It can't be true based on their own numbers. You just read their report. It can't be true. You don't even have to go to the website or read anything else. But the poorest 50%, their wealth fell by nearly 40% in 1 year. Now, can you imagine that actually happening? The riots, the unrest, the starvation, the world would be in a chaotic state if anything remotely like that happened. The reality is that this couldn't have happened in 1 year. It's obvious sensational nonsense. Now, Oxfams go on. The richest 1% earn more wealth than the remaining 99%. 1% earn more wealth. Now, the question is, what do they mean by own? And what do they mean by wealth? Does government wealth get added? Is that in there? Institutions, pension funds, the middle class, landowners? Can anyone seriously think that 1% own more of the planet's wealth by all definitions of the word wealth than 99%? Virtually everyone, in other words, that this few sitting, a few thousand somewhere, earn more wealth than the rest of the planet put together. I would have thought it so obviously nonsense that no journalist would publish it, but instead it's just loved. The rest own the 1%. Now, if the 1% have all this money, how did they get it? Was it by employing the other 99? Was it by selling them goods? How did that wealth come to them? Now, they either stole it, which Oxfam doesn't say they did. So they earned it somehow by profits, by selling and employing and trading and offering goods and services. And if that's true, if that's how they got all this wealth, how come the poorer aren't richer? They should have got incomes, and they should have got goods and services and appliances and fridges and microwaves and cars and clothes and furniture and pension schemes and medical care and aspirins and plasters and spades and shovels and whatever, and bicycles, whatever the poor get. But there's no explanation of how the rich, this 1%, get all this money, more than the remaining 99%. Incomes of the poorest 10% increased less than $3 per annum between 1988 and 2011. Now, I haven't checked this number out, and it could possibly be true. In other words, it could possibly be true that the other 90 or 40 or 60 or 70 or whatever percent are the ones who have had this amazing increase in wealth on the planet, and 10% are somehow left behind in the truly poorest, remotest parts of the planet. And that may well be true. Let's assume it is true. Then what we need to say is, how do we get that 10% to join the 90% whose living standards have risen to unprecedented levels? That's the question that is to be asked by anyone who cares about the 10%. So let's say it's true, which I doubt, but if it is true, then any normal, decent, caring, sensitive human being will say, what can we do to help them? How did the others do it? And how can we extend that to the remaining 10% who are left at the bottom, if it's true? So the reality is that incomes of the 10 to 50%, in other words, the bottom half, increased spectacularly where economies were liberalized, and maybe the bottom 10% didn't join in the celebration of wealth and prosperity. And I'm not saying, please understand this, when I go and visit, as I do, and work in shanty towns and squatter settlements, the East Bank of Alex and Marathon and Delport and Crossroads in the Cape and so on, I see the poverty. I smell the poverty. I touch the poverty. I meet the people. I know the people. It's horrible. But they're alive. They're eating. They've got TV sets. They've got microwaves. They have motorized transport. They can host me in their shack for a community committee meeting in a way that I feel comfortable. I go dressed like this. I walk through the shanty and all the kids greet me, everyone greets me. That is how, and I'm pleased that their living standards are rising, that they've got water they never had before, they've got sewage they never had before, they've got infrastructure they never had before. But I'm not pleased that they haven't got even better, richer still, which is what I would like to achieve. I would like to see faster improvements in their living standards. Why does Oxfam ignore success? It's a mystery. 1% of humanity controls as much wealth as the bottom 99%. UNICEF, on the other hand, another sort of inequality junkie organization, has its own number. It says the richest 20% has 83% of the income this time, not the word wealth. That's the other thing, the slippery use of words. What exactly are they talking about? And we'll see that in a sec. I'm going to sort of close with that. And 1%, according to them, goes to the poorest. Now, according to Oxfam, 0% went to the poorest. Now, 1% is a little bit compounded. It's not inconsequential. With technology, it actually means quite a lot, like cell phones and microwaves and things. So what does control mean? That notably they say that 1% of humanity controls as much wealth. Does that mean the government controls it? What do they mean by control? Do they mean own? By wealth, do they mean income or assets or capital? What do these words mean? And it's actually very difficult to find out. I asked my colleagues who are researchers to find out, and they came back to me with 3 or 4 definitions, all of which contradicted each other. What does 1% include? The 1% who control. Does that include politicians? Does it include workers? The biggest single investor in South Africa is government employees, the Public Investment Corporation. The biggest shareholder now, after Christo Wiese sold his shares, in Steinhoff. The biggest single investor on the stock exchange. Now, does that mean civil servants control more wealth on the stock exchange than anyone else? Is that the meaning of it? I don't know what that word means. They don't tell us. These are just throwaway lines. They're sort of tossed out. And no one is meant to ask. No one is meant to say, what on earth do you mean by this? Because quite clearly in South Africa, civil servants control more wealth than Christo Wiese and Harry Oppenheimer and Johan Rupert put together. So are the civil servants 1%? No, I don't know. What's the figure, Sylvia? Probably 30% or so of 40% of South Africans. I thought everyone at the IRR knew all the numbers, but anyway, apparently not. Then workers through their funds, welfare recipients, do they control anything? If you're a pensioner, as my sister is, and you collect a government pension for the rest of your life, it's yours. You do what you like with it. Gamble, I don't know, visit a brothel, whatever. Not that I think she does that, other than to convert them. But nonetheless, does she control the pension? Do pensioners control pensions? If so, it's a lot of money. Do welfare recipients control welfare? Do the people who get social grants control social grants? And if they do, then this number is nonsense. Obviously nonsense. Nonsense on a fantastically big scale. Not just a little bit of nonsense, just more nonsense than anyone can actually comprehend. And what about voters? Do they control any wealth? Is the fact that a third of the GDP is taxed, is that controlling wealth? Again, these slippery, meaningless definitions and twaddle. So the Oxfam's methodology shows more poverty in the USA than China. That's one of the conclusions to reach. The IEA, Institute of Economic Affairs, called Oxfam data bogus because adding assets and subtracting debts to estimate net wealth implies that the rich, creditworthy people with debt are poor. The Adam Smith Institute called Oxfam data misleading because meaningful measures show greater equality. And they've got a lot of stuff on their website that will show you that there's increasing equality and falling inequality, and I'll try to say something about that too. They say, Oxfam, one CEO earns what 10,000 Bangladesh garment workers earn. Now, let's assume it's true. So what? Are the garment workers earning a little because one CEO has a big salary? But let's assume that is the case. Let's assume the CEO somehow sitting in New York selling cosmetics somehow is milking garment workers in Bangladesh by some strange link. This is presumed to have some connection. Well, the reality is that it's disingenuous to compare the world's richest person with the world's poorest workers. You see, now this is cherry picking again on an insane scale. You don't compare the richest person with workers in the richest country, where the richest person is. You compare the workers with, you compare that. Again, it's just like, it's sleight of hand, smoke and mirrors. It sounds dramatic and bad, but if you unpack it, it isn't. One CEO earns what 1,000 CEOs earn. I looked up the average CEO salary in the United States, and it's 1,000th of what the highest earning CEO gets. So this is really bad. I mean, CEOs are being exploited by CEOs. This has to be stopped. We have to pull down the CEOs who exploit other CEOs. How about this? Oxfam CEO earns what 1,000 Bangladesh workers earn. Now, that's not the number that gets published. The milkman has more wealth. An average American milk person, I suppose is the gender-sensitive one, has more wealth than 100 million human beings on Earth. So the 100 million of the poorest people on Earth essentially earn nothing. They're survivalists. And they have less than... Now, does this mean milkmen, or if you'll excuse me calling them milkmen, are somehow evil and bad and should be pulled down? Milkmen earn too much. You know, we need to kind of destroy their wealth and stop this business of milkmen earning more than poor people. This is the logic. The richest Vietnam man, it says on the website, in their report, earns daily what the poorest earns annually. Well, really? Why? So what? Spurious nonsense. I mean, say it's true. So what? Why is the richest person in Vietnam rich? What did they do to be rich? Save, risk, invest, innovate, write a computer program like Shuttleworth, start a SpaceX like Musk. You know, the people who become, the assumption is that somehow if there's a rich man, I always like the way the word man is used. There's a rich man in Vietnam is rich, like, so what? Why is he rich? Did he do something wrong to be rich? We are never told. We just assume. So, as I say, the agenda, in my view, as far as I can tell, is to maximize poverty. It's to promote envy, suspicion, and conflict. It's to popularize and legitimize disinformation. It's to pull down the rich without lifting the poor. And it's to end extreme wealth, yet no suggestion is made that the poor are harmed by extreme wealth, that the poor will benefit from ending it, that extreme wealth was gained immorally, that the rich, it's no denial that the rich serve humanity, and it's to advance failed ideologies. This, by the way, are the world's 8 richest people and their wealth. You can look it up, it's on Forbes and so on. So the reality versus what Oxfam says. Reality is extreme poverty is virtually eliminated from the planet. The numbers are very simple, readily available. They're in this book, for example, by Johan Norberg, a Swedish economist, called Progress. And depending on how you define it, if it's defined as $1 a day, then it used to be about a third of humanity in the 1970s when Jimmy Carter and others in the United Nations defined poverty. And by that definition, inflation adjusted, it's now down to below 5%. So poverty is well on the way to disappearing completely by that definition. Because that is happening, they've readjusted poverty. It's now $2 a day. And no doubt when everyone's got $2, it'll be called $3 and $4 and $5. Now that's not lots of money, please understand. But nonetheless, this is the reality versus the impression that there's more and growing inequality and poverty. Things have never been better for nearly everyone, nearly everywhere, by every objective criterion. And I invite you all, look up Steven Pinker. There's a lovely video, a YouTube video of him giving a lecture on his forthcoming book called Enlightenment. And it just has chart after chart after chart. Almost any statistic you look at South African Stats SA, at World Bank, IMF, anywhere, any statistic you look at, do it yourself, just stroll the internet and call up some number, life expectancy, healthcare services, square meters of housing, access to food, access to potable water, any number you look at, access to motorized transport, access to increasing safety, industrial accidents, crime, homicides. Every single statistic shows the poor are better off substantially, not just a little. And this should be celebrated. Doesn't mean the problem is solved, I repeat. It means we need to learn from and emulate where it's working. Life expectancy, for example, is up from 30 to 65 years over, and I forget the figure, the date that Steven Pinker has on the graph on the website. I think it was something like 1940 or so, up to now. The average life expectancy was 30, it's now 65. Now listen to what's happening over here. The life expectancy of the rich has been since biblical times 70 years. It's now about 75. In other words, the rich have really lived the same length of time forever. A little bit more with medicine and so on. The real revolution is the poor. The poor are just not dying anymore. Infant mortality has dropped precipitously from something in some areas of the Bihar district of India used to be estimated something like 3 out of 4 don't make it to the age of 5. Now virtually all make it to the age of 5. So every statistic, no matter what you do, what you look at. Literacy, according to Pinker's data, and he has the sources, down from 10% were literate, now 90% are literate, or being schooled of young people, youth. Older people obviously not catching up. Global wealth, as I said, is 3 trillion and rising. According to Credit Suisse, they expect global wealth to have risen to something like, I forget the number, 340 trillion by 2022. So it's rising, and all the indications are that it's getting better. The real world is the Millennium Development Goals have been exceeded, and they were considered ambitious and unrealistic. They've been exceeded. Development indices show better results. 80% reduction in world poverty in 36 years, from 27% to 5%, as defined by I think it was the United Nations, or the World Development, the people who produced the Development Index, United Nations agency. Welfare spending in market economies far exceeds non-market economies in absolute numbers and relative numbers. So rich economies have gone from about 1900 at 1% welfare spending. In other words, the government spent 1% of the GDP on welfare. It now averages over 20%. Seems to have plateaued off, it's stabilized, it's stuck there. So the poor, I mean, effectively poverty has been eliminated in certainly any countries with any kind of decent economy. There just is no more poverty. And 20% of GDP now goes to social grants and welfare and housing and caring for the elderly and so on. Child labor is down to virtually zero in all rich countries. In fact, technically zero. Every now and then somebody's caught and prosecuted. From a time 150 years ago where it was the norm, it was normal. I was myself a child laborer, for what it's worth. I've recovered, I think, quite well from that traumatic experience of, packing peaches or whatever I was doing. The poor risk and lose lives to go where the rich people are. Why do they do that? Do they know something the intellectuals in Oxfam doesn't know? Why do they get in boats and drown and cross borders illegally and get suffocated and hidden in the backs of trucks in order to go from where the policies Oxfam wants are applied to places where there are growing numbers of billionaires at an unprecedented rate, remember, is what they complained about. The poor seem to know something they don't know. If you're going to be poor, then at least be poor where the rich people are. That seems to be the logic. Life expectancy is up, literacy is down, and so on. So the quality of life, 75 years ago, the poor, and I could go through this, I'm not going to. If you just look at the difference between when I was a kid and the way gardeners and building workers and labourers lived then. Our gardener had, his great day was when he got a bicycle. The only time in his life he went in motorised transport was when my dad took him to put him on the train to go back to his traditional area to visit the family over Christmas. He could not write, he could not communicate, he relied on us, the kids, to write letters. Now they have video conferencing on cell phones across the planet. And they had no housing, no appliances, no education, no entertainment. All of this is now the norm for the so-called poor. I'm not saying they're rich, I'm just saying now ordinary human beings on earth have access to everyday things that are taken for granted that were inconceivable when I was a kid. Totally inconceivable. If somebody said that our gardener would be able to watch on his cell phone the Winter Olympics live, it would have been nuts. The only time you ever saw a big event was being there yourself at Ellis Park during a rugby test. There were no TV sets. The shortwave radio crackled too much to hear what was going on. Now, the poor people of the world sit in a shantytown and watch the World Cup soccer. Billions of human beings. Everyone who wants to basically does it live in full color. So what is wealth? Let's talk about this definition of equality, and this gets me towards my closing slides. What exactly is equality? Are they talking about, when they use the word wealth, as they do, they use sometimes the word wealth, sometimes capital, sometimes income, sometimes assets. It slips around like an eel. You can never quite pin it down. But let's use the word wealth, which is the more common one, the more popular one. What is wealth? Is it capital? Does that mean, and if it's capital, is it personal capital or household capital? If you look up the data econometrically, there's typically what they'll talk about is household incomes, household assets. Well, is that what Oxfam's using or referring to? It never tells us. Is it personal or household? What about intellectual capital, skills, qualifications, having a matric, having literacy, having the 3 R's? Is that wealth? Is wealth having a skill, being a plumber? Is that wealth? Being able to do plumbing? What about public capital? Our housekeeper Gladys Nkosi had a hip replacement about the same time as my wife Frances. She paid 50 Rand in the Joburg Gen. My wife Frances, or more accurately my banker, paid 60,000 Rand at this one in Sandton. Now, does she have wealth? The ability to go to a hospital and have a hip replacement, which didn't exist 5 years ago. The most modern technology, fantastic stuff at her disposal, surgeons and equipment and theatres. Is that wealth? Does she have wealth when she has that? Are jobs wealth? Trade unions believe they are. And if you dismiss somebody, you're taking away their wealth, their livelihood. Or do they mean assets? And if they mean assets, do they mean only disposable assets or non-disposable assets? Do they mean houses? Are they wealth? Are savings wealth? Furniture wealth? Is it car wealth? Valuables, jewelry, art, rugs, heirlooms? We are never told. We're just told some people have a lot of wealth and some people don't have wealth. And the wealth that was added to the world went to a few people and didn't go to the other people. What is it that was added that went to the 1%? My suspicion is it's income earning, dividend yielding equities, capital. And then Forbes adds planes, and houses are one or two big assets. So in other words, they define wealth in the thing they use, which is the Forbes rich list, as stuff that rich people have and poor people don't have. I don't have a plane. I don't have a company. If you define wealth as what rich people happen to have, well, then you create the smoke and mirrors illusion that a few people have it all. So what about, is it possessions? Is it personal appliances, TV sets? Are they wealth? Now, let's just pause there a moment. Ordinary people think wealth is getting a new microwave oven, or a fridge, or an iron, or an ironing board, or a bicycle, or clothes. They consider that wealth. But in the Oxfam and the Piketty and the inequality junkie lexicon, what ordinary people consider to be wealth, they don't consider to be wealth. Well, whose side are you on? Ordinary people or elites in cushy jobs? Is it personal? Is it household? So is a TV set one person's wealth or everybody's wealth? Are businesses wealth? Big, small, micro, agriculture. Across the road here is a woman who sells hot dogs, informal street trader. Is her equipment wealth? And if so, then any kind of cigarette box or napkin calculation will tell you that the poor have a great deal more than is acknowledged in this nonsense. Or is it income? Are incomes wealth? Or only fixed assets or capital? Or possessions? What exactly is wealth? You never know. It shifts around like an eel. Is it post or pre-tax? Is it personal or household? Are salaries and wages, return on savings, investment? The members of the PIC, civils and pension funds generally, and medical schemes and so on. But let's take the PIC because it's a nice illustration for us. The biggest investor in South Africa, South African civil servants, they get dividends. They get pensions. Widows, orphans, disabled people, unwed mothers. Do they have wealth by their investment in the PIC? I would say yes, but Oxfam says no. So what about welfare and government? The paradox of socialism, as I said, is that they want the government to provide welfare, and when it does, they attach no value. They say it's valueless. Pensions, education, healthcare, state-owned enterprises, housing, policing, transport, services, the service delivery issues. When they get the services, are they wealthier? They think they are, but Oxfam doesn't. So then you can go on. The other criteria is rights, equality at law, endowments, age, skills, health, family support, community support. Is gender, is being of one gender somehow wealthier than being of another? Is race? Andile and Kakima believes that being white, he told me, being white makes me advantaged, my skin color. When I said to him, you know nothing about me except my skin color, he said, that's all I need to know. Your skin color is wealth, regardless of anything else. So maybe it's true, I don't know. So how do you make darker and lighter skinned people equal? A big challenge. In fact, the interesting thing is, how do you make people equal? If you have a beautiful, brilliant, young, healthy woman and a stupid, ugly, old, retarded man, sickly man, tell me under what conditions you call them equal. If you want equality, tell me what I must do to bring about equality amongst such people. How do I make them equal? You can't, except one way, equality at law. You can give them equal rights. That's the only intelligible sense the word can be used. It actually can't be used in any other way to be vaguely meaningful. So we need to consider what are the causes of inequality, try and fix them, as I've said, find out where does it work, where is it being reduced, and bring about that. And why do judges, entertainers, interestingly, entertainers and sports heroes and book writers, Ken Follett or whatever, who are amongst the wealthiest people on earth, Oprah Winfrey, Tiger Woods, somehow are exempt from this vilification of the rich. Like they are different, because we like them. But somehow we don't like Johan Rupert. But I suppose if he had a reality TV program, maybe some people would like him. Beggars, are they wealthy because they're not working, but they're getting an income, and so on. So it's very complicated, and I really don't want to spend too much time on it, just invite you to consider it, but then to say, what's the problem? Why is equality a bother to anybody? I repeat what I said at the beginning. I really don't care about the rich or about the difference between the rich and the poor. Someone needs to tell me why I should be interested in it. What I care about is the living standards of the poor. And I think any human being with any humanity would say they want the conditions under which the standards of the poor rise fastest and best, regardless of the rich. It's kind of irrelevant what happens to the rich, if you have any decency and humanity in you. The sources, this is my last slide of information. For those of you who want, I can send them to you, you can get the presentation. But Human Progress is a website I encourage you all to visit, which has lots of facts and figures that completely contradict everything Oxfam and Piketty and the other inequality junkies spew. Johan Norberg's book, fantastic book also with lots of data. There's Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, the Cato Institute, even our website at the Free Market Foundation. But you don't have to look at anything. I want to say don't even bother with the source. Just look up your own index. Just Google life expectancy, child mortality, literacy, just any one of these things, and you will see for yourself the astounding improvement in the human condition that has taken place over the last few years. And that's what we should be celebrating. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thanks for your attention. And if time permitted, just to show you the other sort of thing. I'm going to show you this quickly. I'll just run on quickly. That's the Gini coefficient that shows how unequal people have been since World War II. Basically all the countries or regions of the world running along here. And it looks as if some countries are highly unequal and some countries are highly equal. But just to show you what trickery takes place, what chicanery takes place. I don't know if any of you can notice what's wrong with this graph. That you're being lied to and cheated with it, or at least you're being given the wrong information. The points are all correct. This is what's wrong with it. It's got the top and the bottom cut off. And if you look at the whole graph, there's actually not much in it. It's not nearly the big deal we have the highest Gini coefficient. Every country says that, by the way. Everyone thinks they've got the highest, whatever. For some reason, there's a kind of national pride in having the highest. But we claim the highest. But it makes a difference between wherever, who was that? Brazil, Mexico. I think South Africa is here somewhere, maybe not. No, I don't see it. I think South Africa is here somewhere. But that's the sleight of hand, the deception, the trickery that takes place. Okay, with that, thank you very much, and I'll take questions and answers. And I hope I've challenged you to really question the ethics, the morality, the degree of caring for humanity that these people who babble on about inequality have. And I think they are reprehensible. I think they are not interested in the poor. I think they are obsessed with the rich, a kind of weird, perverse obsession. It's almost kinky. And that's, I think, justified by the data and the facts I've shared with you. Thank you. Well, you're assuming I know. The Gini coefficient, as far as I can remember from when I did study it, and anyone here is free to correct me, is a study of, it's an index of pre-tax, and I think it's pre-tax incomes. In other words, the difference between the gross incomes of the rich, and what it says is that if it's 1 or 100, typically what people use is 100 instead, 1 on the index, that's at the top, would imply that one person has all income. That's where Oxfam says the world is headed, towards that state. 0 at the bottom would be where everyone is equal. Everyone has $10, or one person has all the dollars. The Gini coefficient is the degree to which the percentage of people, or the proportion of people near 1 versus the proportion of people near 0, and if there are fewer people near 1, it's called a higher Gini coefficient. That's the number. In other words, it means fewer people have more wealth when you have a high Gini coefficient on the scale of 1 to 0, or more commonly it's displayed, I think, as 0 to 100. Yeah. Oh, but just to remind, the Gini coefficient and the econometricians who produce and use it, like Stats SA and the Reserve Bank, do not pretend that it's measuring differences in wealth or capital or assets. It's simply a simple number, pre-tax incomes. I think it's pre-tax. It's not net incomes or how much people really have, and it doesn't look at household incomes. So, for example, in the Gini coefficient, if you have a population with lots of children, you have a high Gini coefficient because they nominally earn nothing, even though they might be living in luxury homes. And so countries with lots of children seem to have a higher Gini coefficient, and so it goes. Big households seem to make the Gini coefficient look higher than small households, and this is involved with culture and race and history and stage of development. So one has to be very careful with the Gini coefficient to understand what it actually measures, and then decide whether that measurement is relevant to any particular purpose for which you want to apply it, anything you want to think about. For example, the Minister of Finance, before the budget, might want to know the Gini coefficient to know what the implications will be of a higher tax rate on people near the top versus people at the bottom. And what you find when you have a high Gini coefficient is that high tax rates on the rich generate very little revenue. You just imagine everyone on the same income. A higher tax rate generates precisely that proportion of national income. If only one person is near the top, then a higher tax rate on that person generates very little. So there might be a useful purpose to which to put the Gini coefficient, but there's not much use, frankly, to which you can put it. It's just an interesting number that happens to be available. Yeah.
Questions? Stunned silence? Surely somebody has something to question you.
Goodness me, why is that? Have I answered all the questions, or have I not generated any?
You're all just gobsmacked.
Yeah. You don't have to be polite, but...
Just an observation. I don't think you defamed Oxfam. You criticised them very strongly, but with huge justification. I think there's a little technical difference. One can bring trouble, but not defamation.
I try to be
what a
critical.
marvellous criticism.
And
lots of evidence.
I'm
Thank
aware
you.
of some really good work they've done, and they're wonderful people who work there. So let's have that clear. Yeah. So thanks for raising that. Yes, I want to defame this inequality spewing. It's a kind of sewer that spews out this nonsense. Yeah. I saw your hand.
I'd first like to apologise because I was
taking you backwards. Just a simple question, what's there to gain for Oxfam by fabricating these figures? What's the real reason behind?
Oh, yeah. I think, let's say you and I are the board of Oxfam, or the executive committee. And we see around us, we exist in order to help the poor. And when we were created 50, 60 years ago, there were lots of terribly poor people, including starving people, children dying. It was a ghastly world. And we see around us this is all disappearing. We are going to say, well, hell, how are we going to earn a living? What are we going to do? We have to go and raise money. So we have to come up with a new story. And the new story seems to be there's inequality. Now, we don't have to tell anyone why there shouldn't be, we just say there is. And if we state a shocking enough number, they think something has to be done about it. So I think it is self-serving. I think it's a way of perpetuating its legitimacy in its life. And that's, again, normal human behavior. I mean, that's what you do. If you and I are the exco, we sit around saying, how can we generate income? And one thing might be reinvent ourselves. Start being a propaganda organization for ideology, a propaganda organization against market economies or whatever. So you know, I can see why they do it. But at the very least, they should do it honestly. You know, now how you do it honestly, I don't know, because in fact, the need for Oxfam has largely disappeared. Or what they should do is they say they're just trying to raise the standards of people at the bottom who are no longer poor as originally defined. I mean, think of South Africa. You and I know that there are people here we call poor. You're too young to know what it was like, say, in 1950. Then what you think is now poor was, you know, kids with kwashiorkor, or emaciated adults, people living, you know, in garbage dumps. It was really pretty horrible. And that improvement in the living standard of black South Africans, because yeah, it has this racial connotation, is great. But it's nowhere near the wonderful society we would like to see. So if Oxfam said, our job now is to promote small business and to help people get skills and jobs and improve their houses, which what we do in the Free Market Foundation. We go and help them get improved quality of housing in shanty towns. That, I think, would be a legitimate thing for Oxfam to do. And frankly, if they did it, I would be their best friend. I would want to partner with them and work with them. But what they're doing now, I'm afraid, is really bad for the poor. Really, really bad. Because they're trying to destroy the system that has alleviated poverty so amazingly. And that's very reprehensible. I think it's despicable.
Is there a distinction between literal poverty, as in shanty towns, and figurative, as in, for example, an elderly person in Sandton, who now no longer has an income and has tenants living on the property, and tenants don't pay rent, therefore she's poor.
As it happens, we have a colleague who's in exactly that position, but whose tenants are not paying, and because of the laws, it's very difficult for them to do something about it. No, but you see, the answer is, I suppose this is a great question, because what you're saying is, what do you or I think poverty really is? And that's legitimate. In other words, if you say this person living in Sandton whose tenants aren't paying rent is poor, or strangely enough, I believe, rightly or wrongly, I hope rightly, that Christo Wiese really did not know what was going on in Steinhoff. Now, I know in this room are people who will probably say, of course he did. But I have reason to believe that he was himself taken. He's the biggest loser by far. He's the biggest victim. So how anyone can consider him a culprit, I don't know. But strangely enough, having tumbled from 50 billion to 10 billion, I think that's kind of sad. I feel for the person. It's he's still immensely wealthy, of course. But I think you're right. I think real poverty is a difficult thing to get your brain around and define. And I repeat, I will take you to one of these shanty towns, sit you down with wonderful people, surprisingly bright. I'm amazed how they understand town planning laws and building codes and how bulk supplies work and that sort of thing, who live a very nice life. And then you're quite right, there can be someone who's a widow with theoretically lots of money living in Rivonia, who we might feel more sorry for. So I think, again, as human beings, our humanity has to say that it's not a case of how many rands the person has in the bank that makes them well off or badly off. It's other factors. Do they have families, support groups, communities, social welfare, employment opportunities, literacy, education, physical strength, health? You know, so somebody who's physically strong could at least go and get an unskilled job on a farm or something. But I think you're right. It's a subtle, complex issue. And to ask the question, I don't have the answer. I don't think anyone has the answer. It's about humanity.
I just wanted to ask, why do you think some of the wealthy people themselves often tend to be quite defensive about their own wealth at the moment? And you often get like people like Richard Branson and stuff who have a go at other, tax issues with, I mean, I think that doesn't help, does it?
No, I just thanks for raising that. I got into a lot of trouble because I once wrote my weekly newspaper column about how fantastic Jews are. And somebody said, well, I'm just a Jew. Well, I'm not. I'm an Afrikaner, boy from Potchefstroom. And they said, oh no, we don't like, I was actually called by a representative of the Jewish Federation and asked not to say this sort of thing. They don't like saying Jews win all the Nobel Prizes and Jews are the most successful people in business and Jews just outperform all of us at everything. The Jews in this room, are probably feeling very embarrassed now and hoping I won't say this. But I agree. I can't understand why business people have to demean themselves and embarrass. It's like a professor who makes some fantastic academic, scientific breakthrough, feeling embarrassed about it and denying it and saying, well, it wasn't really me and it wasn't really important and I didn't. No, I agree with you entirely. I think it's wrong. They should stand up. They should say, I made my money because I took risks. I came up with ways of serving the poor more satisfactorily than my competitors. I came up with ways of coming up with better clothes or cosmetics or furniture or building materials or whatever. Every rich person who got rich honestly, obviously there are exceptions and they should all be jailed. Business people who made their wealth honestly ought to really feel good about it, because every rand they have is a rand they have in return for good they did. It's the way their value to society is measured. And if anything should be a sin, it's the loss, the person who makes a loss. I agree with you entirely. I don't know if there are any people in this room. I know, for example, one who's been the MD of a large corporation, so I assume compared to me is obscenely wealthy, and I hope he goes away feeling bloody good about it and that he deserved every cent, and what he did in order to get it was wonderful for the workers and the consumers and the country. And these are the people to whom statues ought to be built. And I say, yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's a pity. It's a pity. It's like, it's like some religious groups. Would a Protestant stand up and say, we're better than the Catholics or the other way around or whatever? I suppose some religions do, but people ought to be proud of their accomplishments. Yeah.
Hi Leon, I don't know, we do know each other through some things that we're trying to do to help the foundation, so hopefully that will come to pass.
And you are?
My name's Keith Morris, I'm the chairman of a group of companies called the Galley Watery Group.
Oh.
Several of our companies are actually involved in helping raise lots of money for charities like WWF, UNICEF, Girls and all off. And I came today because we've been considering working for Oxfam. So I wanted to know whether we should be working for Oxfam. And to be honest, I think 90% of what you said I will not challenge in the slightest. But I'd just like to contextualise one thing that you said. And I'd urge everybody to go and have a look at, does anyone look at TED Talks to see interesting insights around the world? There's a very interesting TED Talk about...
But the pinker one I refer to as a TED Talk.
Yeah. If you've got people who are running businesses that turn over 6 billion a year, do you want somebody who earns 10,000 rand a month, or do you want the best person you can find? And that best person might cost you 400,000 rand or pounds. But if they're doing the right job and they're making the money, they're worth every single penny. And I do think that to take UK salaries and to multiply them times 18 may fall slightly into the territory of spin, Leon, because it does make your case slightly better. Somebody earning £100,000 a year in the UK is not a huge salary to run the kind of organisation. So I just wanted to contextualise that. The rest of it, I think, you've made some very good points. But would it make me decide not to work for them? I understand why they're doing what they're doing, because they need to raise money. So how do you raise money? It's sometimes easier to raise money by saying outrageous things rather than less. Does that make them bad people? Does that make them scammers? You haven't convinced me, but thank you for the presentation.
Just, thanks for raising this point. You're right, of course, that amount of money is not serious. It's fine. I mean, if you run Oxfam well, I wouldn't mind if you get £1 million. The whole point is we shouldn't worry about the rich. The problem is that they complain about the rich. So what I'm saying is that this is disingenuous. In other words, if they believe you shouldn't be wealthy, and they believe some people shouldn't have great multiples of wealth compared to other people, they are not an example of it. That's the relevance of their salary. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't earn it. On the contrary, almost like you raised over there, I would like them to be proud of it. I would like them to say, I run Oxfam so well that I should earn twice what I earn. I would support that entirely. And, I just like some anecdotal stuff. I don't know if any of you know Steve Ballmer was, but he was the CEO running Microsoft after Bill Gates, and the company was going downhill. And he was a disastrous CEO, and they paid him, I think it was $1 billion or $2 billion, to leave. Severance pay. Please go, he has $1 billion. The real money he made was the shares he had went up, I think the figure was something like $8 billion worth of, because him being out made the company more worthwhile, to the extent that he made not only his severance package, but his shares value went up. So the point is sometimes, and then the other iconic example was getting Steve Jobs back into Apple when it was going down, and he turned it into, for a while, the biggest company in the world. Now, if you pay Steve Jobs $1 billion a month, it's a bargain. If you pay Ballmer $1 billion to go, it's a bargain. In other words, the amount of pay that CEOs get, you're absolutely right, should be a function of their value to the organization, including Oxfam. So yes, I'm not, I think then we may be at close to 100% agreement.
How much should we pay Zumi to leave his post?
Well,
don't answer that, that was not a real question.
As it happens, I'm the only person who thinks she should stay his distance, but that's another debate. Yeah.
I think what's happened is because Oxfam's report is aimed at Davos, you have the richest people, most powerful people in the world there. They're not politically savvy. You can create a sense of guilt. It's virtue signaling of the first order, and that's the narrative that is really sort of successful at the moment, that very social justice narrative. So you can instill a fair amount of guilt. The problem is, and I think coming from the NGO sector, is that you're not going to do very well if you instill fear, loathing, and guilt in the people you want to earn money from. And I don't think it has longevity. It's just it ends up being a publicity stunt rather than really a way for Oxfam to earn money for changing times.
Yes, and Sylvia, you might be more insightful than you even realize, because I did look briefly at statements, one set of statements from the past and one now, and their percentage of money from private donors has dropped precipitously. It's now overwhelmingly from governments, and so they persuade governments that they're alleviating social ills, and governments put it all in the social budget, which for me is a problem. Some of that 20% is going to Oxfam, which is being used, in my view, to make things worse for welfare recipients. So the governments think they're providing welfare, but in fact it's harming welfare. So I would say, yes, I think you're right. This guilt trip does appear to be backfiring, but they're getting the void filled by those same people at Davos, but via tax, the taxpayer. In other words, all the money still comes from the private people, but it's now just coming via the government.
And Leon, your timing of your talk, of course, couldn't be better with this explosion about the Haiti in Oxfam.
And South Sudan.
And South Sudan, and which got me sort of thinking that I'm sure Oxfam do, in some of these countries, post-hurricane and post-earthquakes and stuff, do good work. And rather than have a research department investigating how inequalities in the world, they should be advertising the good work they do, and maybe talking how efficient they are in turning government sponsors, now it seems most of their money comes from governments, into good work on the ground. It boggles my mind that they even have a research department doing the research into inequality that they have.
Yeah, I think what's important here is that the dishonesty in this annual propaganda sort of deluge, diarrhea, I think runs the risk of permeating the organization. In other words, every single one of our, I forget how many thousand workers there are around the world, is in an organization that is kind of inherently being disingenuous and dishonest and fabricating information. So that the reason I showed all of that, what happens in Haiti and the child abuse and the prostitution and so on, any organization can have it. Yours could, mine could in the Free Market Foundation. The problem, I think, is that for 10 years they were told about this problem and did nothing. So I think there's a culture, and this is what I would invite you to take very seriously, a culture of, that just is an unhealthy culture, not a culture of nip it in the bud, sort it out, investigate, suspend the person. Because when the organization by its nature just lies constantly, that has to have an effect on the ethics and the morality and the so on of the entire organization. That's why I think that stuff's relevant. I don't think it matters much if somewhere someone, well, I'll give you a simple example. A German foundation most of you will know the name of, and some of you have probably worked with, had a head in South Africa who was found to be a pedophile. And this German organization immediately sent him back to Germany, suspended him, had him investigated, passed the information on to the prosecutor. There was no hesitation, no, just got on with it. All of us would think more of the organization. We don't think less because it had such a person. We think more of it because of the way it dealt with it. That, I'm afraid, is not the case with Oxfam. It's not giving one any feeling that they care about integrity and values and ethics. On the contrary, it seems that they don't, as a culture.
Sorry, can I just comment? I mean, I want to disagree slightly with that, because I think you're being a bit defensive in terms of the Oxfam thing, because as you sort of implied, if Oxfam was really doing its job well, it should be out of business by now, because it was supposed to be getting rid of poverty. And what I think it does in a lot of countries is actually lower expectations about what is achievable. Do you know what I mean? It's very small scale projects. I'm not saying they might not help the odd individual village, but putting a tap in a village is not the same thing as building a dam or a reservoir which can actually alleviate the lives of many. There are problems that obviously, but I mean, you look at the China 3 dams thing, right? Yes, there were problems with that, and I think those need to be in terms of how you compensate people and the disruption to some of the sort of small communities and so on. But in terms of the overall benefit to the whole country, do you know what I mean? And I'm just thinking, you know, I do think that we mustn't give that much credence to the wonderful work that Oxfam is really doing. I'm sorry, I have to say.
Yeah, I think my concern is not so much that Oxfam does wonderful work. I think some of the people in Oxfam are wonderful people. That's different. I think the organisation is completely rotten through and through. And but my heart goes out to the sincere, honest people in it, as it goes out to the sincere, honest people in the South African government. You know, I think there are some wonderful public servants, teachers, nurses, judges, magistrates, you know, and it's just sad that they caught up in this rotten structure.
Leon, you said that for the last 30 years or so, the general prosperity of the world has increased a lot and all those good things. Boris Becker, the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chancellor, made a statement last year that they naively predicted in the world that the African population would stabilize. And we know the correlation between prosperity and birth rate and all that. And he said, we are facing a disaster. Countries, Ethiopia, which is one of the more prosperous and advancing fast growth rate, they are facing a world record in population growth. They will go from, it's unbelievable, in the next 30 years from 60 million to 180 million. Now, how does that all tie up?
I'm going to pass on that. It's population is one of the things. Is one of the things I haven't. I don't consider myself qualified to discuss. I suppose the most I can say is probably just general. Everyone knows that as countries become wealthier, population plateaus off and then appears to start actually declining slowly. And I think it's true that in African countries, the ones that have grown at high growth rates, Mauritius and others, that's happened. And I think it's true that within South Africa, I think IRR has published data that within South Africa, the fertility rate, as it's called, amongst middle-class black South Africans, which is now something like 6 million, up from something like 700,000 in '94. In other words, a massive growth, has also reached almost zero population growth. So it does seem to be a prosperity issue in some part. I'm sure there are other variables, culture, race, religion. But I would imagine, I think it's true to say that the way to stop population growth is to have economic growth or to slow it down. Having said that, I would raise another issue is, I'm not sure population growth really is a problem anyway. What's the problem is poverty. You want people not to be poor. You know, if I look around this room and I say, well, which of you shouldn't be here? No, I want you all to be here. I just don't want you to be poor. So when people say there's overpopulation, I think what they're really saying is there's poverty. They're not saying, let's cut a few throats. They're not saying some of these people shouldn't be here. I think they're saying these people are too poor. And if you say that I want a solution to the problem of poverty, you come up with a set of policies. If you say I want a solution to the problem of people, you come up with something completely different. You put contraceptions in the water supply and so on. One of them leads to coming up with policies that create investment and jobs. Another one comes up with policies that stop people procreating. Very, very different approaches. But so, and this is really speaking from ignorance. I really don't know enough to know whether we should think there are too many people or whether we should think there's too little wealth. That's really the question. Yeah.
I'd like to make a statement on that. The problem is actually in the education. Because with the I come from a digital background. My name's Alarmist. I was in from web business development. So we look at it from the digital side and the business, and it's the education. The kind of jobs and the kind of economic growth that's out there is not going to help the future. Because people are not seeing that we need to go in different new ways that have just been discovered. We're going in the same direction, more people going in the same direction, and more poverty. But if you start diversifying, then we're going to...
We develop the skills, yeah. I'm afraid on education and population are really not my fields of expertise, so I would bow to the superior knowledge of some of you in the room. That it?
I just want to add a last point just to add to what you said. You're talking about what is wealth. Is it property? Is it this? If you say take the affluent suburbs of London, something Oxfam would probably come out with, 50 square metre flat in a certain area may cost you £500,000. A large, fairly medium-sized farm in the north of Scotland may cost you £200,000. And that's, of course, the wealthy created that situation in London. If it wasn't for the wealth, it wouldn't be there. So Oxfam shouldn't worry about those people living in £1,000,000 residences at all.
Quite why it wants to pull them down is a mystery to me. That's its main call this year in Davos, is pull down, what do they call extreme wealth, destroy extreme wealth. They don't produce, they don't give a reason why we should want to. They just say it should happen because it's there, and it shouldn't be there for no reason there's no analysis, there's no argument, there's no, say, because of ABC, we shouldn't have extreme wealth. There's nothing like that. Just sort of takes it for granted that there's something inherently wrong with it.
Sorry, I don't think it takes it for granted. I think the nature of coming back to the language, the nature of the language implies something without saying what it is.
Yeah. It isn't, I think they don't hide the fact that they're an ideological organization with an ideological agenda, and that agenda is anti-business, anti-capitalism, anti-market economy. That's what they want to advance. And that's strange, because that's not where it started. It used to be a genuine charity to help the poor, and that's unfortunately where it didn't stay. Yeah. One more maybe?
So it'd be interesting to see the countries that actually donate the type of economy that they have. How many predominantly socialist countries make massive donations to Oxfam?
No, it's the rich. It's the rich capitalist countries that give it virtually all its income. So it comes from the very countries that they decry. The countries that they say are bad are the countries that fund it to say so. Yeah.
Questions? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation. And thank you to all of you.